Catherine, thank you very much. In addition to the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation supporting this symposium, we also had support from Pedro and Carol Quattrocasas, the Club of Rome, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Smithsonian Grand Challenges Consortia. All of those banded together to make sure that we could do this today. Before I introduce Roberto to begin this morning's session of speakers, and it's about time we got to the speakers, a few housekeeping things just so you know what's happening. Today we'll have two sessions as shown in your program of speakers, of invited talks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. After the afternoon session of speakers, we will then have a panel discussion in which we will invite the 6 speakers to come up on the podium. This discussion will be moderated by Undersecretary of Science Eva Pell. This will be an opportunity, even though we will have some time after each of the talks for questions from the audience, we are looking forward to using the panel discussion particularly to engage the audience in the discussion. I believe outside the front doors, Maggie and Jessica have put a number of 3x5 cards. This is your opportunity during the day, write down any questions or any subjects or comments you might have that you'd like the panel to address. And we can collect these in the baskets outside, or you can hand them to me or one of them, and we will use these in part as the basis for the panel discussion this afternoon. So don't forget to do that. Okay, with all of that now, it's my pleasure to introduce Roberto, who you've already heard from or heard about, who will chair this morning's sessions. Thank you very much.
Good morning. So we are now ready to begin the morning session proper, where we will hear from Dennis Meadows and Jorgen Randers, two of the authors of Limits to Growth, as well as from Lester Brown. And I'm particularly pleased that we have here in the audience with us Jay Forrester, as well as Bill Behrens, another of the authors of Limits to Growth, particularly given the role that they had in the project. I will just say a couple of words on the history of limits, and then give the floor to Dennis. In June 1970, in one of the first meetings of the Club of Rome in Bern, Switzerland, Professor Jay Forrester was asked to talk about his system approach to industrial dynamics. And as his ability to explain a difficult way to approach complex problems impressed very much the people that at that time were part of the executive committee of the Club of Rome. Saburo Kita, Edward Pestel, Hugo Thiemann, Alex King, and my father, Aurelio Peccei. And the executive committee was so impressed that they actually asked Professor Forrester whether he was prepared to construct a systems model that would simulate the interaction among the various components of what they call the problematique. That is, the interconnected macro problems that they were beginning to affect the world: population growth, resource depletion, et cetera. And Professor Forrester agreed to do so, and relatively quickly produced the first simple model of a problematique, which of course he called World One. What else would you call it? And Forrester's World One model was highly aggregated, but already showed interesting features. And the Club of Rome, with the support of the Volkswagen Foundation, decided to entrust to Professor Forrester and his team at MIT a study to see whether they could make a more robust model that would still illustrate the problematique. Dennis Meadows, whom you will hear in a second, had joined MIT as a young faculty member in 1969, and he became the head of this team of 16 young scholars. And one of the outputs of their study was, in fact, Limits to Growth, which was presented exactly 40 years ago in the Smithsonian Castle at that time, and then went on to sell over 10 million copies in 35 languages, and became one of the most influential environmental books in the world. So with that, let me now briefly introduce Dennis, although Dennis does not really need to be introduced, but he has had a very distinguished academic career in free universities, MIT, Dartmouth, and the University of New Hampshire, until he retired in 2004. Not that that made any difference, because he's continued to do exactly what he did before. He continues to be very active, speaking, writing, advising corporate and government leaders across the world. And Dennis has authored 10 books, including 2 of them with sequels to Limits, both written with Donella Meadows and with Jürgen Randers. Dennis has received many honorary degrees, both in the US and in Europe, and in 2009, he was awarded the Japan Prize. So it's a pleasure for me to ask Dennis to come up and give his lecture on something that he has provocatively entitled, "It is Too Late for Sustainable Development," and we'll see what he has to say.
I know it took a lot of inspiration, financial support, and a lot of hard work to organize the meeting today. And I wasn't personally involved in that, but I'm enormously thankful that it turned out to be a success. So I thank Cress, Roberto, Secretary Clow, Ian Johnson, my old friend from the Club of Rome, and President Lawrence from the Mitchell Foundation for making it possible. I hope at the end of the day you conclude it was worthwhile. Before I get into my formal remarks, which incidentally will require that we switch over to the PowerPoint slide set which I provided, I'd like to just describe to you 3 feelings that I bring into the meeting today. First, I feel very privileged. I don't know anyone else who's had the possibility to start and almost end their professional career with addresses before the Smithsonian Institution. It was 40 years ago today that I stood up for the first time. That was my first public presentation of the results of our study on the limits to growth. There'd been a few private briefings to the club itself, but this was the first public presentation. And now, 40 years later, this will most likely be one of my last. So I just feel very honored that I've had the opportunity to do that. The second feeling is really that I consider myself to be very lucky. You know, we're here to honor a book, The Limits to Growth, which has, after 40 years, I think we can say more serious readers today than it did when it was first published. It's a classic. It's, I think, something which will continue for a very long time. But it came about through a very, very unusual combination of partnerships. I can think of 4 of them. First of all, of course, was Aurelio. His genuine concern for humanity and his vision led to the creation of the Club of Rome, and then eventually to the decision to do a project and to the raising of the money for that project. The second totally essential ingredient was Jay Forrester, who made the first contact between the Club of Rome and MIT, who invented with his students and associates at MIT a new technique for integrating economic, social, technical, environmental, and other areas of knowledge into a coherent theory, and then went ahead and used it to develop the first prototype world model. In a way, I'm Jay Forrester's intellectual son. I don't suppose he would choose to describe the relationship in that way, but he was my dissertation advisor, and in a way, Jürgen is therefore Jay's intellectual grandchild, because I was Jürgen's dissertation advisor. The third element of this recipe was the team. There were 16 of us who worked like heck for 2 years, from 1970 till 1972, most especially Jürgen and Bill Behrens, who are here today and who served as co-authors on the first book. Global research was a lot more difficult in those days. You couldn't just call up the web and go to Wikipedia and find out what was going on. required sending people down to Washington and digging through the archives and sending away for books and so forth. And the team did an absolutely phenomenal job of carrying that out. And then, of course, the fourth and totally essential component was Donella. She wrote the book. Her brilliance, her genius, her ability to communicate collated all the various insights and computer scenarios and so forth that we had generated and put them forth in this volume, which became known as The Limits to Growth. She and I and Jorgen then participated in the second edition and again in the third edition, which was largely completed before she died. So I just feel lucky that I, by accident, had the opportunity to come together with those four different groups at a time when it was possible to make an interesting new statement about these issues. And the third feeling I have today is one of apprehension. 40 years ago, I stood up and presented a question. How can global society organize itself to provide a just, peaceful, equitable, decent living for its people? Now, after 40 years, finally, the question is starting to be considered seriously. But I'm apprehensive. I have to say that although the question is still important, the answer is different than it was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, it was still theoretically possible to slow things down and come to an equilibrium. Now that's no longer possible. And as you'll see from the gist of my remarks today, what lies ahead is a period of uncontrolled decline, which will bring us to some new equilibrium, many of whose features we're not able to perceive yet. The theme of this conference is absolutely essential. We do need absolutely to understand the nature of a sustainable planet, and we need to do everything in our power to prepare for it. But the path to it is going to be different. And I'm apprehensive because when I speak the truth, it tends to be easy for people to become pessimistic and resigned, or simply to label me as a lunatic and reject the message totally. You'll see in about another half hour whether I have managed to learn how to speak these things and leave you with some sense of mastery and optimism, because those are the appropriate sentiments. But mastery and optimism need to be coupled with a realistic understanding of what lies ahead. Now, before I get into my formal remarks, I'd like to lead you through a very quick exercise, which is a metaphor for much of what I want to say today. So I have to ask you to please put down all your stuff. And even the people out there in video land can do this. Cross your arms. Look down and see which wrist is on top. Okay, drop your arms. Great. Now cross your arms. And look down and see which wrist is on top. So, of course, we're in a scientific center. I'm going to do now a piece of empirical research. Everyone who had the same wrist up both times, raise your hand. So, me too. And those of you who are out there watching this on the web, you should know that virtually everybody in the audience raised their hand. So we all tend to cross our arms the same way, which suggests, I suppose, that there's an optimum. So let's see what it is. Everyone who raised their right, or had the right wrist up both times, raise your hand. Everyone who had your left wrist up both times, raise your hand. It's about 50-50. So it means you can do it either way, but you get into the habit of doing it one way, and that's the way you keep. And this is, of course, totally appropriate. One crosses your arms when you want to do something that don't require your arms. And it would be really stupid to sit there for 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do with your arms when you actually want to be doing something else. So you adopt a habit, and it works for you. Growth is like that. We have, over the last couple centuries, adopted a set of habits, which range from the nature of our financial system to the indicators we choose for success, to the norms that we impart to our descendants and so forth. We have a whole set of, very elaborate set of habits that we've developed, and they've been very successful. But sometimes circumstances change. And now the circumstances have changed, and we need to develop new habits. And I'm going to give you practice. Cross your arms the other way. What you notice is three things that are also true about our quest for a sustainable planet. Number one, it's possible. Number two, you have to think about it and probably make mistakes at first. And number three, it's a little uncomfortable at first. Exactly those three things lie ahead for us as we try to understand how to change our policies into ones that will serve us a little better in the future. Now, I've put together a slide set. I can see already that it's too long. I'm much more interested in what Jorgen and Lester have to say than what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to stick with my time limit and skip over some of my slides. I ask you, A, to forgive me in doing that, but to remember that all of these slides are going to be available on the web anyway, so you don't need to write them down. And I did take the effort to make them fairly self-explanatory, so even if I don't directly address them over the course of my remarks today, if you go back, if you find them interesting and you go back, it will be clear what I was doing. So, goals for this session. I'll briefly describe what we did in 1970-72. Then I'll describe the major contributions of our thing and talk about why now it is no longer possible for sustainable development. And as a result, I'll suggest that it is essential to add to our current efforts ones which begin looking specifically at the resilience of our system. So what did we do? Well, that says it in quick terms. 16 of us worked together for 2 years with the support of the Club of Rome, under the goading of Aurelio Peccei. We built on Jay Forster's model, bringing a large amount of empirical data, more contemporary vocabulary, more and more diverse tests of policy and so forth together, and finally developed a theory of long-term causes and consequences of physical growth, mainly in population and industry. And our focus was on 5 of the really important physical parameters: population, industrial goods, food, non-renewable resources, and persistent pollution. Now, the title of our book was actually a mistake in one sense. I think it led to the popularity of the text, but it badly misconstrues what we really did. We did not prove that there are limits. That actually seemed to us self-evident, naive as we were. We assumed that there were limits on a finite planet, and then we began to try and understand the nature of social growth within those limits. We did present a lot of information about different physical variables simply to make limits plausible. But if you believe that the market has built into it the invisible guiding hand, or if you think that technology has the magical capacity to spring up and solve every physical shortage, or if you think some divine presence is going to come down to earth and save us all from our folly, you can read Limits to Growth and still be totally unconcerned about physical limits. The book is an exercise in thinking for those who recognize limits and want to know about their consequences. And what we said was, A, that physical growth, mainly population and industry, are inherently exponential. We talked at length about exponential growth. We pointed out that exponentiality can take you to very high numbers quickly, which means in practical terms that we will reach the physical limits to growth on this planet soon. What does soon mean? Well, that's not something you can tell from our models. We were painfully eager to point out that we're not in the prediction business. But I think I can say that, I said back in '72 that it would be during the lifetime of most people in the audience. Our scenarios, as you'll see in a moment, showed growth peaking out and starting to decline in the period 2010 up to 2050, depending on what assumptions you make about technology and consumer choices and so forth, but in this period. And let me say, outside the context of our scientific analysis, I think today the issues which are confronting the Western world are absolutely a manifestation of these limits. They aren't recognized as such and probably never will be, but they come directly from the fact that we have left a period of easy dumps, cheap sources, and open space, and are now having to cope with expensive resources, pollution which now starts to fight back at us, because when we dump it someplace, it turns out the dump is next to somebody, and so forth. We showed that the prevailing policies, the political and economic policies of the day, were not going to deal with these limits in an orderly and peaceful way. They were not going to produce asymptotic approaches to the limits. Quite the contrary, they would shoot past the limits and then lead into a period of decline. And we pointed out in the book that if we could change some policies, not only technical policies, but social and cultural policies, then a different future was plausible. One in which we were more or less in balance with the limits of the Earth, and within which it would be possible, not inevitable, but at least possible, to achieve equity and peace, and so forth. Well, that was 40 years ago. The first three of these conclusions, I think, are still valid. I don't think that we any longer have the chance of changing policies to achieve sustainable development, at least not in the way sustainable development is generally construed. I wrote a preface for a book recently on sustainable development. The author claimed that there were 100 different definitions for the term. When you have a word or a phrase that has 100 definitions, it means it's really meaningless. It's simply used by people to justify doing whatever it is they were going to do anyway. But to the extent that sustainable development does have any kind of central meaning, it seems that it means we get to keep what we've got, and the poor can, come up to our level. We get to keep doing what we're doing, except only it just won't have as much impact on the environment. Those are lovely fantasies, but they are really no longer the basis for a realistic set of policies. Why is that? Well, I could cite many reasons, but I'll, looking back, go quickly over 5 things I've observed that have been the case for the last 40 years. So the first is that the public has difficulty with subtle and conditional messages. Just a couple examples. We presented 12 scenarios in the book, 12 computer scenarios. 4 of them showed equilibrium, fairly attractive outcomes. 8 of them showed, well, 7 showed collapse, and 1 was a little bit ambiguous. But immediately after we did that, the first review of our book, published in the New York Times, said, "It is no coincidence that all the simulations based on the Meadows world model invariably end in collapse." It just is much more interesting to talk about the book in that way. With roughly half of our scenarios being equilibrium, you would imagine that over the last 40 years, roughly half of the media illustrations of our work would show the equilibrium runs. But you would be wrong. I have never, I think in 40 years, I have never seen any newspaper, any journal, any television program show the equilibrium scenarios from our run. They focus on overshoot and collapse. Another example, we said again and again, these are not predictions. We're talking about dynamics and behavior mode. Nonetheless, you see statements. I just did a Google search on the phrase, the Club of Rome predicted, and it yielded 13,700 hits, which are of this sort. In 1972, limits to growth, predicted that the world will run out of gold, I mean, so there you are. Fact number 1, nuanced, conditional discussions are not what the media likes. We're not the only ones who suffer from this. The climate scientists these days face exactly the same problem. People can deal with weather predictions because they're short-term and demonstrably provable or not. But when a climate scientist gets up and starts talking about scenarios, it's simply impossible for the public to understand what's going on, and it's very, very difficult for the media to give any sort of realistic and educational summary of the work. Second problem we had is that the growth advocates, and I don't speak only of economists, actually most of us are growth advocates if you get down to it, change the justification for their paradigm rather than changing the paradigm itself. I used to think this was a special attribute of economists, but I've been trying to understand this phenomenon, and more recently, in fact just now, I'm in the middle of a book, a really brilliant book by Robert Trivor. It's called, as you can see, The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception. And he points out that it's an evolutionarily attractive attribute to develop the capacity for self-deception. I don't have time to get into his argument, but it makes sense to me. And what he says, you know, is that we continually filter and bias and adjust and select the information which comes into us, not to learn about what's really going on, but to confirm a set of impressions that we already hold. In our case, this has taken the form of an evolution in the criticisms. In the 70s, the critics said, well, there are no limits. I mean, anyone who thinks there are limits just simply doesn't understand. Then in the 80s, it started to become clear that there are limits. And they said, well, okay, there are limits, but they're very far away. We don't have to worry about them. In the 90s, it started to become clear that the limits weren't so far away. The 90s were a decade with a lot of excellent scientific work on the damage which was being done to various parts of the ecosystem, for example. So the people who held the growth paradigm said, well, you know, maybe the limits are near, but we don't need to worry about them because markets and technology will take care of them. In the last decade, it started to become clear that technology and the markets aren't taking care of them, at least in a way that's very helpful to us. And so the response changed once again to the fact, well, okay, but it's still necessary to sustain growth because that's what gives us the resources we need to deal with these problems. I think we're now into the period of serious difficulties, and there are starting to be signs that the criticism or the rationale has changed over to, well, if we had been able to sustain growth, we wouldn't have had all these problems. You can see this, for example, in the peak oil debate. The people who used to say there were no limits to oil are now starting to say, well, if we had only been able to sustain the investment we needed, we would have had the oil that we wanted. Not that there isn't infinite oil, but simply that we don't have it. Just two examples. This is a 1970s critique. You can see, given enough energy, minerals might be reclaimed from the sea. And they said in the New York Times article in 1972, a virtually infinite source of energy, the controlled use of nuclear fusion will probably be tapped within 50 years. What I like to say, nuclear fusion has a brilliant future, and it always will have. In the 90s, the criticisms have changed a little bit, but you see it's still the same thing. And natural resources are not infinite in any meaningful economic sense. Meaningful is a little bit of an oxymoron there. Mind-boggling though this assertion may be, this is the Julian Simon line of approach, which is often cited, not only by Julian, as a reason for forgetting about these issues. So that's the first reason we haven't acted. The second reason is, the third reason is that the global carrying capacity has now really risen far above its sustainable level. This is a summary of an empirical research project reported by the Dutch Environmental Agency. The two curves are our equilibrium run and our standard overshoot run. And the simple question was, over the last 40 years, do the empirical data that we can gather from real world activities seem to be lying along any of these scenarios? And the conclusion, as you can see in each case, is that, and these little red dots represent different years of empirical data, we're tracking right along the overshoot and collapse thing because we haven't changed our behavior. It's so much easier to change your rationale than to change your behavior that we've simply kept changing the rationale for not changing our behavior. And as a result, we have grown past the limits. The whole issue of what is the carrying capacity of the planet is a very difficult one technically and philosophically. The best work that I've seen is, actually was introduced to me by Jorgen, is by Matas Wackernagel, his ecological footprint concept. And this shows his calculations from 1965 up to 2007 for the global ecological footprint of human activity. The blue line is an approximation for a sustainable society, one in which the annual regeneration of resources by the planet equals the consumption. You can see that in 1972, we were at about 85% of sustainability on Matas's calculations. And so when I stood up in front of the Smithsonian 40 years ago, I could, in fact, say that we just need to slow down. Now we're at about 150% of sustainability. And I can't say anymore that we just need to slow down. We need to get back down. This is kind of like the San Francisco earthquake. You know it's coming, but you don't know when. that curve is going to come back down. When? Well, we don't know. But I think that it will stop growing during the lifetime of many who are watching this symposium today. Montes is very clever. He focuses on calculations, not extrapolations. He never runs his curves out. And notice, he also assumes or represents that the carrying capacity isn't damaged by being over it. We all know that's false, but pretending that that's the case eliminates a whole body of critique, which means that it forces people to focus more narrowly on what he's actually doing, and I think that's a very wise decision. We did extrapolate. This is a picture from the original book. Figure 35, the so-called standard run. I still remember in 1972, Bill Barron's standing at one end of the stage in the Smithsonian, and Jorgen Randers standing at the other end of the stage, holding up a big foam whiteboard poster with that illustration on it. Sans red lines. I've recently put the red lines in. Notice that in 72, we still had about 20 or 30 years of growth ahead of us. Time enough. But now we're here, 2012. I don't for a moment take this as a prediction. And actually, personally, I always quit paying attention to the curves once the first major one peaks out, because for sure that would engender in the global system changes major enough to invalidate some of the assumptions in our model. So but this is what I have, and so I've chosen it to make a couple of points today. This is, incidentally, the stabilized run. It doesn't have to be like that. Back in 72, we showed that if you make appropriate technical and social changes, you could avoid this outcome and move the global system over into a period of balance with its physical limits. Just for the fun of it, or because it was the only thing I knew how to do in order to get some perspective on it, I did a comparison of the values for the main variables in this equilibrium run versus our standard run for 2012 now and 2020. And this is what I got. Let me explain this to you. So here are the 5 variables, non-renewable resources, population, persistent pollution, and so forth. And the red bars show the ratios in 2012 between the overshoot run and what we could have had in the model if we had implemented our equilibrium policies back in, I think, 1975. We would have had twice as many resources if we'd done that equilibrium policy than are shown now in the standard run. Population would have been at about 80% of its value. Pollution, practically gone. The persistent pollution surge mainly comes after 1972 in the model. Food would be about the same, although that's a little misleading because in the standard run, just now, we're entering a period of rapidly declining food per capita. But in 2012, the ratio is about the same. And industry, actually somewhat less. That's because of the investments which have been shifted over into technological advance and so forth. By 2020, the situation becomes more dire. Now, if we had done the equilibrium run, we would have had 3.5 times as many resources as are shown in the standard run. Population would be slightly lower as a ratio. Food per capita starts really to become significantly greater. And industry is back on track. A period of 40 years of investment is enough to make the transition. But we didn't do that. Why? Well, and fourth reason, to some extent important, we act as if technological change can do the problem, solve the problem for us. I going to use just one quick example. I could use many: soil erosion, water depletion, et cetera. I'll use CO2 emissions since that's on the podium this afternoon. This is the curve, the data that we published in 1972. Notice that our report doesn't seem to have had much impact on the growth in CO2 emissions. And I might say, in my defense, the Kyoto Accord hasn't had much impact either. Everyone acknowledges that we need to stop CO2 emissions, but they just keep growing. Why? Well, CO2 emissions can be envisioned as a product of 4 factors: number of people, standard of living, which is the units of capital per person, energy required for each of those units, and then the fraction of that energy that comes from fossil fuels. Especially in Europe, but also now in the United States and Japan, increasingly in China, you're seeing emphasis on these areas. Energy efficiency is a significant target, and there's an effort to subsidize so-called solar sources and bring down the fraction of energy from fossil fuels. But as long as you focus on the technical factors and ignore the social factors, you have no chance of arresting the growth. The capacity for growth in living standard and in population is more than enough to offset anything you can do on the technical side. And for that reason, we have not solved the area of CO2. We haven't solved lots of problems. I have a whole set of slides that talk about our dependency on oil. I'm going to skip over them. They make the point that oil production globally is now in a period of decline. Oil is an absolutely essential part of our lifestyle and economy in the United States. There are things that we could do to move off of our dependence on oil, and we aren't doing them. Just a minute. This shows what's happening to oil production. It's predicted to decline by 50% over the next 2 decades. And you're starting to see it in the prices. Limits to growth, I want to say, was not responsible for that jump. You see, there are, and now we're almost at the end of my remarks, there are easy problems and hard problems. Easy problems, I use the same conceptualization. We're here now, and we want to be up here later, and in this case, I'll say that more is better, and this is time. Imagine 2 actions. For easy problems, the actions which actually solve the problem make it look better also over the short term. Next evaluation, let's say, is the next election, or the next time you have to issue your quarterly earnings report, or the next time you take an exam, whatever. It's the next time somebody's going to evaluate what you're doing. The market and politics deals with these problems quite well. Unfortunately, in achieving sustainability, we're dealing not with easy problems, but hard ones which require sacrifice now in return for benefits later. The problem which can be solved, the actions which solve those problems over the long term make things look worse in the short term. You know, we need to increase the price of energy now in order for it to be lower than it would have been later. We need to reduce certain kinds of economic activity now in order to slow climate change so that we'll have more flexibility for industrial production later. Unfortunately, the next evaluation comes long before we can take credit for the fundamental solutions. And we're stuck in a system now where politics and the market systematically drive us over the cliff. Okay, well, what does that mean? It means that we are coming into a period of uncontrolled decline. We just came through a period, or we're coming toward the end of a period, hopefully, of uncontrolled decline in housing. You know, the Dutch had a period of uncontrolled decline in tulip bulb prices. Bubbles are an inherent feature of our system. It's hubris to imagine that we, although we couldn't manage housing, we can somehow manage our dependence on energy and population and so forth. I mean, it's just a fantasy. exactly the same arguments which were put forth to justify the irrationalities of the housing market are the ones which are put forward now to say you don't have to worry about population and so forth. And what it means is that we need to maintain our efforts to reduce pollution, to change our energy sources, to reduce our reliance on violence as a way of settling differences. We need to keep that. But in addition, we need now to start focusing specifically on the issue of resilience. If we go through this period of decline without foreknowledge, without preparation, I fear that it will strip away many of our fundamental values, that we will be left afterwards with a system that is very, very unpleasant. If we can build resilience into the system at different levels and then go through this period of decline, knowing that at the end of it, we will have the capacity to engineer the system in a new way, sustainably, then I think we can sustain our commitment to democracy, equity, and so forth. And that's the challenge for us. I have some slides that talk about resilience. They're self-explanatory, so I leave you to look at them if it's of any interest. And I conclude with just one final exercise, which probably is the most important point I've made in my entire speech. So once again, I ask you to put down your stuff. I want all of you in the room to clap your hands at precisely the same moment. Now, let me say, this is a serious exercise. I'm not just angling for applause here. I'll explain to you how to do it. I'm going to count to 3 slowly. 1, 2, 3. Then I'm going to say that word, clap. Don't do it now. Then I'll say that word, and then you all do it at precisely the same moment. If we're successful, outside it will sound like there was just one giant in here clapping his hand. Okay, here we go. I'm going to count to 3. Then I'm going to say that word, and at precisely at that moment when I say the word, you do it. 1, 2, 3, clap. You understood what I said, you agreed with it, and you wanted to do it. But as soon as my actions were different than my words, you pay attention to my actions, not my words. That, unfortunately, is true also for sustainable development. If you go out of here promoting sustainable development, but your actions are consistent with Overshoot, that's what you're going to get. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. We have time for one question. We will have time this afternoon, but do I see a question?
No question.
No question.
I will interject. No, we should just move ahead. It's time for Jorgen, and this afternoon, plenty of time for questions.
All right. Okay. How can I argue? All right.